I flew 8,000 miles, spending thousands of dollars, from New Zealand to attend my younger brother's wedding in Hoboken, only to arrive at an empty venue. My family had secretly changed the location without telling me because they claimed I'd make it all about myself. 42 days of absolute silence passed. Then last night, my phone crashed from an onslaught of 250 terrified texts and calls from them. I can stick my neck out on $1 million that I know exactly why they have suddenly become all worked up. And it has something to do with Grandpa's original will. Keep watching to see how my family reacted when they discovered, too late, that in their attempt to smoke out one stubborn New Jersey rat, they ended up burning down the whole house. So there I was, standing on the rain-slicked, uneven cobblestone pavement outside a historic, exposed brick event space in the heart of Hoboken, New Jersey, staring at the darkened, completely empty interior through the towering floor-to-ceiling glass windows, when the crushing, humiliating reality of my family's deliberate cruelty finally anchored itself permanently in my chest. Exactly 48 hours earlier, I had locked the heavy oak doors to my penthouse apartment overlooking the breathtaking glacial waters of Lake Wakatipu in Queenstown, New Zealand, where I had spent the last 5 relentless, exhausting, and ultimately triumphant years building a multi-million-dollar powerhouse career as the founder and lead director of the Southern Hemisphere's premier luxury event production and high-end tourism firm. I had spent nearly $8,500 of my own hard-earned money securing a last-minute, agonizingly brutal multi-leg flight, flying from Queenstown to Auckland, suffering through a massive layover before boarding a grueling 14-hour trans-Pacific red-eye to Los Angeles, and finally sprinting through the terminal to catch my connection to LaGuardia, all for the sole purpose of surprising my younger brother Andrew on his wedding day. I had received the glossy, elegantly embossed digital invitation months ago, detailing a sophisticated, intimate evening ceremony and reception at this exact Hoboken venue. And because I loved my brother deeply, despite the vast geographical and emotional distance that had always separated me from the toxic, image-obsessed, fiercely competitive echo chamber of my extended family, I had moved literal mountains to be there. I had rescheduled high-profile corporate clients, handed over the reins of a massive tech summit to my junior partners, and endured 30 continuous hours of recycled cabin air and cramped seating just to show up for him. I had stepped out of my premium rideshare vehicle wearing a custom-tailored midnight blue silk suit that I had commissioned specifically for this occasion, holding a beautifully wrapped, velvet-lined box containing the keys to a complimentary, all-expenses-paid luxury honeymoon I had personally curated for Andrew and his new bride. A 2-week excursion through the Southern Alps featuring private helicopter tours, 5-star alpine lodge accommodations, and exclusive vineyard tastings, completely, fully funded by my own accounts. My heart had been hammering against my ribs with the genuine, naive anticipation of a joyful family reunion, a desperate hope that for one night the petty grievances and deep-seated jealousies of my childhood could be set aside to celebrate new love. But as I cupped my cold hands against the damp glass of the venue, peering into a dark, vacant room that held absolutely no chairs, no floral arrangements, no bustling caterers, and most devastatingly, no family members, a profound and terrifying silence wrapped around me, broken only by the sound of the freezing October rain hitting the pavement. I pulled out my phone, assuming there had been a catastrophic last-minute emergency, a power outage, or a sudden venue change due to unforeseen circumstances, and dialed Andrew's number, only to be sent immediately to a generic, automated voicemail after a single ring. Panic beginning to flutter in my throat, I dialed my mother, my father, my older sister, and 2 of my aunts. Every single call rang exactly once before clicking over to an automated machine. A synchronized digital blockade that made it entirely and horrifyingly clear that my numbers had been preemptively muted or blocked by the entire familial collective. Standing entirely alone in the drizzling coastal rain, shivering in my silk suit, I opened Instagram, navigating with trembling fingers to the profile of my new sister-in-law's overly vocal, fiercely attention-seeking best friend, a woman named Brittany, whose desperate need for social media validation I knew I could entirely rely on in a moment like this. The screen violently illuminated the damp, dark street around me as her stories loaded, revealing a sequence of brilliantly lit, professionally filtered, high-definition videos of my entire family dancing, laughing, and clinking crystal champagne flutes under a massive, opulent floral archway woven with white roses and eucalyptus. The geotag on the video did not say Hoboken, New Jersey. It proudly displayed the location of a sprawling, ultra-exclusive private estate nestled deep in the Hudson Valley, a minimum of a 3-hour drive north from where I was currently standing in the freezing rain. As I watched a video snippet of my mother joyfully adjusting Andrew's boutonniere, dabbing fake tears from her eyes while my aunts cheered in the background, a notification suddenly popped up at the top of my phone screen from an anonymous iCloud email address. It contained a single, devastating screenshot of my family's massive group chat, appropriately titled The Real Family, presumably leaked by a younger cousin who finally possessed a shred of moral discomfort regarding the sheer scale of this betrayal. The message, written by my Aunt Iris, the undisputed, venomous matriarch of our family's relentless, toxic gossip mill, read in glaring blue text. Don't tell her the new address. She's been in NZ so long, she'll just try to make the whole day about her grand return. Let's have one day that's just about us. She's just going to brag about her big New Zealand life and her fancy business and make us look like small-town losers. Let's keep it intimate. Andrew deserves the spotlight. Beneath that staggering display of insecurity, my own mother had replied with a simple, validating heart emoji, followed by a text from my father, also in support, and finally, the absolute death blow, a text from my brother, the groom himself, reading, "Agreed. It's just easier this way. If she really cares, she can just send a gift from the airport and go back to her sheep." I stood there on the desolate sidewalk, the cold rain steadily soaking into the shoulders of my expensive suit, completely absorbing the absolute, unvarnished truth that my family had not simply forgotten me, nor had there been a logistical error. They had actively, maliciously, and painstakingly conspired to exile me from my only brother's wedding. They had allowed me to fly 8,000 miles across the globe, spend thousands of dollars of my own money, and arrive at a meticulously planned decoy location simply because their own profound, deeply ingrained insecurities could not handle the presence of a woman who had dared to break free and build a successful life outside the claustrophobic boundaries of their mediocre suburban existence. I did not scream into the empty street. I did not drop to my knees in dramatic, cinematic despair. And I did not march to a rental car agency to drive 3 hours upstate to crash a party where I was explicitly, entirely unwanted. Because my cutthroat career in high-end business has taught me one fundamental, unbreakable rule. You never, ever force your way into a room that has intentionally locked you out. Instead, you quietly, methodically ensure that you own the entire building. I turned my back on the darkened Hoboken venue, walked to the nearest municipal trash can on the corner of the wet street, and dropped the beautifully wrapped velvet-lined box containing the $30,000 luxury honeymoon itinerary directly into the garbage, watching the rain immediately begin to warp the expensive wrapping paper before I continued walking 3 blocks through the downpour until I found a brightly lit, entirely unremarkable local New Jersey diner. I slid into a cracked red vinyl booth that smelled faintly of bleach and old frying oil, ordered a black coffee and a standard greasy cheeseburger from an exhausted waitress who took one look at my soaking wet, custom-tailored suit and wisely decided not to ask any questions. I sat in that neon-lit diner for 2 solid hours, methodically chewing food I couldn't taste and drinking scalding coffee that burned the back of my throat, systematically and silently processing the profound, suffocating grief of losing a family that was still entirely alive, while my phone remained completely and utterly silent on the Formica table, untouched by a single message of apology, explanation, or even basic human concern from the people celebrating 3 hours north in the Hudson Valley. But while my parents, my aunts, and my newly married brother were busy toasting to their successful deception, arrogantly patting themselves on the back for protecting their fragile egos from my supposed bragging, they were completely, blissfully oblivious to the fact that I was not the only member of the family who absolutely despised their superficiality. Nor was I the only one who had known about their pathetic, spiteful little scheme. I paid my tab, tipped the weary waitress a $100 bill, stepped back out into the freezing night, hailed another premium rideshare, and directed the driver not to LaGuardia International Airport, but to a high-end, heavily guarded assisted living facility located 45 minutes away in the affluent, quiet suburbs of Bergen County, the permanent residence of my 90-year-old grandfather, Peter. Grandpa Peter was the undisputed patriarch of our bloodline, a brilliant, ruthless, self-made industrialist who had accumulated the massive, sprawling generational wealth that my parents, aunts, and uncles had spent their entire adult lives desperately waiting to inherit. Entirely unbothered by the fact that they had never worked a genuinely hard day in their privileged lives. He had officially refused to attend Andrew's wedding, citing his rapidly declining health and frail heart. But the brutal reality, which he had shared with me during our weekly 2-hour international phone calls that no one else in the family knew about, was that he found his children and grandchildren to be a collection of insufferable, greedy, entitled vultures. And he had explicitly warned me weeks ago that they were planning something deeply spiteful regarding Will. But I brushed it off as old age talk. When I walked into his sprawling private suite, my suit still damp from the rain and my shoulders carrying the heavy, unspoken weight of the evening's ultimate betrayal, he didn't offer any empty platitudes, superficial comfort, or apologies on behalf of his deeply flawed offspring. He simply looked at me from his worn leather armchair, his sharp, faded blue eyes missing absolutely nothing of my heartbreak, and pointed a trembling, age-spotted finger toward the heavy steel biometric safe bolted into the reinforced wall of his walk-in closet. Truth is, I'd come back to New Jersey, not just for the wedding I was always destined to be locked out of, but also to meet Grandpa, who wanted me to be physically present before he executes an arrangement he had been meticulously planning with his elite private estate lawyers for the past 6 months regarding his will. An arrangement I now know was specifically designed to completely blindside the leeches who thought they had the financial game entirely rigged in their favor. I entered the complex alphanumeric combination he'd made me memorize, swung the heavy fireproof door open, and retrieved a thick, wax-sealed manila envelope containing the absolute, unalterable original copy of his finalized last will and testament. This document was a masterpiece of legal retribution. It explicitly named me as the sole, uncontested executor of his entire estate and the primary beneficiary of his massive, multi-million-dollar trust, while simultaneously freezing all of his children's immediate access to the family funds, stripping them of their assumed lump sum inheritances, and placing their incredibly modest allowances into severely restricted, drip-fed accounts managed entirely, permanently, and exclusively at my absolute discretion. He made me look him in the eye and promise to take this original, notarized document back to New Zealand with me, far away from the manipulative, grasping hands of my mother and Aunt Iris, knowing that my physical possession of the true document outside of the country's jurisdiction would be the ultimate, unbreakable safeguard against the inevitable legal warfare they would attempt to wage once he finally passed away. I sat with him in the quiet, sterile room for 3 hours, holding his fragile, paper-thin hand, talking about the majestic mountains of Queenstown, the massive corporate empire I had built from nothing, and soaking in the only genuine, unconditional familial love I had ever known in my entire 30 years of existence, before I finally kissed him gently on the forehead, promised him I would protect his legacy from their greed, and walked out into the dark night with the total sum of my family's financial future tucked securely in my jacket. I checked into an anonymous, sterile airport hotel near LaGuardia, spent the night staring blankly at the popcorn ceiling while listening to the mechanical hum of the air conditioning unit, and boarded a brutal 30-hour flight back to New Zealand the very next morning without saying a single word to anyone, entirely ghosting the people who had gone out of their way to make me a ghost in their own lives, transforming from a heartbroken sister into the cold, calculating architect of their impending financial ruin. I spent the next 42 days entirely immersed in what modern internet culture refers to as ghost mode, refusing to post a single update on social media, ignoring the sporadic, guilt-driven, incredibly shallow text messages my mother eventually sent, claiming they had tried to reach me about a tragic last-minute venue change due to flooding, and completely severing all digital, emotional, and psychological tethers to the eastern seaboard of the United States. I threw myself violently and immensely productively into my work, orchestrating a massive, multi-million-dollar corporate tech summit on the pristine shores of Lake Wakatipu, expanding my firm's international portfolio by securing 3 new luxury resort contracts and finding a profound, unshakable sense of peace in the absolute echoing silence that radiated from my personal cell phone. I knew perfectly well that my family was sitting comfortably in their suburban New Jersey homes, sipping wine and smugly assuming that I was simply throwing a massive tantrum, pouting in isolation, and nursing a severely bruised ego because they had successfully put me in my place and protected their precious hometown dynamic from my overwhelming success. They genuinely believed they had won the invisible rivalry they had invented entirely in their own deeply insecure minds, operating under the arrogant, fatal assumption that because I was entirely out of sight, I was entirely out of power. Completely and blissfully unaware that the heavy manila envelope locked securely in a fireproof titanium vault in my Queenstown corner office was a ticking financial time bomb waiting to absolutely decimate their entire perceived reality. Then, on the evening of the 42nd day, as I was sitting alone on my sweeping glass balcony, watching the vibrant orange sun dip behind the snow-capped peaks of the Remarkables mountain range, with a glass of world-class local Pinot Noir in my hand, the explosion finally happened. My phone screen violently illuminated, the device literally freezing, overheating, and crashing as an unprecedented onslaught of 250 terrifying, increasingly frantic text messages, missed calls, and panicked voicemails flooded into my inbox in the span of 30 chaotic minutes. Grandpa Peter had passed away peacefully in his sleep earlier that morning. A profound, heartbreaking loss that I grieved silently and deeply from 8,000 miles away. But for my parents, aunts, and siblings, his passing was merely the starting gun for the massive inheritance grab they had been salivating over for the better part of a decade. According to the frantic, fragmented, and utterly unhinged messages rapidly stacking up on my glowing screen, my parents, Aunt Iris, and Andrew had immediately stormed the estate attorney's upscale Manhattan office within hours of the coroner leaving, loudly demanding the immediate liquidation and distribution of the assets to fund their extravagant lifestyles and pay off their mounting suburban debts. They had been met by Mr. Jackson, a stone-faced, uncompromising senior partner who calmly informed them that the estate was entirely frozen, that the outdated copies of the will they currently possessed were legally void, and that the only valid, notarized, and executable original copy of the document, the one dictating the absolute control of every single cent, was currently residing 8,000 miles away in the unyielding possession of the very woman they had deemed too arrogant and insufferable to attend a family wedding. The tone of the incoming text messages transitioned from arrogant, entitled demands to absolute groveling, terrifying hysteria within a matter of minutes, completely abandoning their previous narrative of me being a bragging outcast. First came my mother. "Scarlett, sweetheart, please pick up the phone. Immediately, Mr. Jackson is saying you have the original document and we can't access the accounts to pay for the funeral arrangements. This has to be a mistake." This was rapidly followed by my Aunt Iris, her usual venom replaced by sheer desperation. And ultimately, the most satisfying message of all came from Andrew, the brother who had told me to go back to my sheep. "Please, sis, I need the money from the trust to close on my new house with the twins on the way. The lawyer says we get nothing without your signature. I'm so sorry about the wedding. Please don't ruin my life over a stupid mistake." I sat there in the cool, crisp New Zealand twilight, watching the frantic notifications continuously stack up on my screen, reading the terrified, desperate words of people who had actively conspired to lock me out in the freezing rain of Hoboken, suddenly realizing that they were now entirely, legally locked out of their own survival, completely and irreversibly at the mercy of the small-town loser they had tried so hard to humiliate. I did not reply to a single message. I did not answer the relentlessly ringing phone, and I did not offer a single word of comfort, because I had finally learned the ultimate, undeniable lesson about toxic family dynamics. You do not negotiate your fundamental worth with people who only discover your value when they desperately need something from you. And you absolutely do not throw a life preserver to the people who intentionally and gleefully threw you overboard. I knew that the extensive legal probate process would require my eventual participation, and I fully intended to execute my grandfather's final wishes to the exact, brutally restrictive letter of the law, ensuring they received nothing more than the meager allowance he deemed them worthy of. But for tonight, and for the next several agonizing weeks, I was going to let them sit in the suffocating, terrifying panic of their own making. I took a slow, savoring sip of my expensive wine, turned my phone entirely off, and looked out over the sprawling, beautiful, endlessly successful life I had built entirely with my own two hands, completely at peace with the knowledge that the absolute greatest revenge against people who try to make you feel small is not to yell or scream or crash their pathetic parties, but to quietly, methodically take the keys to their entire kingdom, lock the iron gates from the outside, and let them slowly realize exactly whose world they are truly living in.